His wife and daughter died at 2:47 in the morning. By 2:48, the hospital corridor was the quietest place in Seoul. Nobody called him sir in that hallway. Nobody called him anything. The nurses who passed him looked at the floor. The attending physician delivered the news and then took 3 steps backward before turning to leave. The way you back away from something you don't fully understand but know, instinctively, not to turn your back on. Seo Jinho had built that reaction over 30 years. Fear, deference, distance. He had decided at 14, watching his mother cry over an eviction notice she couldn't pay, that he would never again be the person in the room with the least power. He kept that promise to himself. For 30 years, he kept it. And now he was standing in a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, and he had all the power in the world, and his wife was dead, and his daughter had never breathed, and not one single gram of everything he had built could do anything about either of those facts. He stood in that corridor for 4 hours. He didn't make calls. He didn't summon anyone. He didn't give orders or ask questions or do any of the things that had defined every waking hour of his adult life. He just stood there, in the fluorescent light, in the silence, a man who could level entire operations with a single conversation, reduced, completely and without negotiation, to someone who simply did not know what to do next. That is where this story begins. Not with the empire, with a man who has forgotten how to be a person, and a child, 7 years old, alone in Chicago, sitting in an alley with a broken pen, who is about to remind him. There is a question that psychologists have spent decades trying to answer. Not a glamorous question. Not the kind that gets published on the front page of academic journals or discussed at conferences with good lighting and expensive coffee. A quiet question. An uncomfortable one. Why do the most emotionally fortified people, the ones who have spent years, sometimes decades, constructing an impenetrable interior life, sometimes make the single most vulnerable decision of their existence not in a moment of strength, not in therapy, not in safety, but at the absolute bottom of their worst moment? Why then? The answer is not romantic. It is neurological. When the human brain experiences catastrophic loss, the kind of loss that doesn't just hurt but restructures, something happens in the prefrontal cortex. The systems responsible for self-protection, for risk calculation, for the careful maintenance of emotional walls, they don't just weaken. They go quiet. Therapists and grief researchers describe something like a window, a period, sometimes hours, sometimes days, where the architecture of self-defense that a person has spent a lifetime constructing simply suspends. And in that window, in that brief, raw, unguarded interval, people do things they would never do in ordinary life. They call the person they swore they were finished with. They forgive something they said was unforgivable. They make decisions that the defended version of themselves would have dismissed in seconds. Sometimes those decisions are mistakes. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, they are the most honest thing that person has ever done. Have you ever made a decision in your worst moment that turned out to be the truest one? A moment when losing everything somehow made you braver than you ever managed to be when you still had something to protect. Seo Jinho left that hospital at 7 in the morning. He didn't go home. He didn't go to any of the locations where his people would expect to find him. He didn't return calls. He didn't eat. He had a flight to Los Angeles later that day for a meeting he had arranged 6 weeks earlier. A meeting involving significant money and significant people, and the kind of conversation that required complete psychological control. He got on the flight, not because the meeting mattered to him anymore, but because he didn't know what else to do with his body. And motion, forward motion, any motion, was the only thing standing between him and the full weight of what that hospital corridor meant. He was running, not from the grief, toward anything that wasn't standing still inside it. And that is the only reason he was in Los Angeles. That is the only reason he was walking down a particular street in a particular neighborhood at a particular hour. That is the only reason he turned into an alley behind a convenience store, not for any strategic reason, not because anything was waiting for him there. Just because his legs kept moving and that was the direction they went. The most important moments of our lives almost never feel important when they are happening. They feel ordinary. They feel like a man who hasn't slept in 30 hours turning into an alley for no reason at all. She was sitting cross-legged on the ground. 7 years old. She had a broken pen and a paper bag from the convenience store, and she was drawing something on it with the focused, unhurried concentration of someone who had nowhere else to be and had made a private peace with that fact. She didn't look up immediately. And when she did, when she finally registered that someone was standing at the entrance of the alley watching her, she didn't startle. She didn't scramble to her feet or back against the wall, or do any of the things a child alone in an alley at that hour might reasonably do when a large, exhausted, hollow-eyed stranger appears. She just looked at him, directly, steadily, the way children look at things before the world teaches them that looking too directly at powerful people is dangerous. Jinho had not been looked at like that, without calculation, without fear, without an agenda positioned behind the eyes. Just looked at, like he was a person, like he was simply a person who had appeared, and she was simply a person who had noticed, and neither of those facts was particularly threatening. He would think about that look for the next years. He would never fully be able to explain what it did to him. We'll get to what happens next. But first, you need to understand who she was, where she came from, what the world had already taken from her before she was old enough to understand that it was being taken. Let's start with him, because you need to understand what kind of man was standing at the entrance of that alley. Not the reputation, not the mythology that accumulated around his name like sediment over 30 years. The man underneath all of that, where he actually came from. Seo Jinho was born in Incheon. Not the Incheon of today, the gleaming port city, the international airport, the carefully curated image of a nation that rebuilt itself from rubble into something the world couldn't ignore. The Incheon of his childhood was something else entirely. It was cramped and loud and economically brutal, the kind of place where dignity was a resource people rationed. His father was present until Jinho was 9, and then he wasn't. No dramatic exit. No final confrontation. No explanation that a child could hold onto and examine later for meaning. He simply left one morning, and the morning kept going and the days kept accumulating, and at some point the family stopped waiting for the sound of his key in the door. His mother didn't collapse. That was the thing about her that Jinho would carry his entire life. She didn't collapse. She took on a second job, then a third. She came home with hands that hurt and a face that was learning, incrementally, to reveal less. She fed him. She kept the lights on. She never once said a single bitter word about his father in front of him. But Jinho was 9 years old, and 9-year-olds are not fooled by silence. He watched her. Every evening. The way she sat after dinner with her hands flat on the table, not moving, just existing in that brief interval between the end of one exhausting thing and the beginning of preparing for the next. The way her eyes went somewhere he couldn't follow. The way she was present and absent at the same time. He decided something at 9 years old. He didn't articulate it. He didn't have the language for it yet. But the decision formed in him the way convictions form in children, wordlessly, completely, with a permanence that reason can't touch. Nobody will ever look at someone I love like that again. I will make sure of it. By 14 he was running errands for the local syndicate. Not because he wanted power. That comes later. Power is what happens when survival strategies outlive the conditions that created them. At 14 he wanted one thing: to stop watching his mother calculate whether she could afford to be sick. He was precise. He was reliable. He didn't talk more than necessary. The men above him noticed, the way predators notice stillness, because stillness in a young person is either fear or control, and Jinho's stillness was unmistakably the second thing. He rose. By 30 he controlled more of Seoul's underground economy than most people knew existed. His code was absolute: no civilians, no children, no operations that created the kind of chaos that governments couldn't ignore. His word was the only contract that mattered. But here is what nobody tells you about men who build empires on control. The control is never really about the empire. It's about the 9-year-old boy who watched his mother's hands go flat on a table and decided, in the wordless way of children, that he would never be powerless again. The empire is just the architecture of that decision. 30 years later, he married in his late 30s. Her name was Yoon Seo-yeon, and she was the only person in his adult life who treated his silences as something to sit with rather than something to fill. She was a literature professor. She had strong opinions about Russian novels and weak opinions about most everything else, and she found his world, not thrilling, not romantic, but comprehensible. She understood, in the way that deeply perceptive people understand things they have no direct experience of, that he was not a cruel man. He was a wounded one, And she loved him with the particular patience of someone who has decided that a person's wounds are not the reason to leave but the reason to stay. They had 4 years together. 4 years and then a pregnancy, and then a hospital in Seoul in the rain and a corridor and a fluorescent light and a silence that swallowed everything. And that is where we left him. So now let's talk about her. Her name was Nia. She was born in Chicago in 1996. Her mother, a woman named Celeste who worked as a seamstress and sang in her church choir with the kind of voice that made strangers stop in hallways, died of an aggressive illness when Nia was 4 years old. Nia remembers 3 things about her mother. The smell of the fabric she worked with, something warm and faintly chemical that Nia would spend years trying to identify in other spaces without ever fully succeeding. The specific weight of her hand on the top of Nia's head when she was blessing her before school. And her voice. Not words. Just the quality of it. The texture. The way it could make a room feel smaller and safer at the same time. Nia lost those things at 4 years old. And the mind of a 4-year-old does not process that kind of loss the way an adult mind does. With language, with narrative, with the ability to construct meaning around absence. It just registers. Gone. Here. And then gone. And the going had nothing to do with anything I did, but I was too small to know that yet. Her father was a jazz musician. Genuinely gifted. The kind of gifted that is almost indistinguishable from cursed, because it makes ordinary life feel insufficient, and the gap between what you hear in your head and what the world is willing to pay for it becomes its own particular torment. He loved Nia. That part is important. He loved her in the real way, not the convenient, uncomplicated way, but the actual way, which includes showing up imperfectly and being present erratically and trying harder than your circumstances make it easy to try. But grief does things to people. Losing Celeste did something to him that he didn't have the infrastructure to survive intact. He began to disappear into himself in increments. First the late nights, then the inconsistency, then the longer absences, then the kind of absence that has a physical address but is still, functionally, completely unreachable. When Nia was 6, the state made it official. She entered the foster system. I want to pause here, because there is a version of this story that treats what happened next as a backdrop, as context, as the difficult beginning that makes the eventual rescue feel more meaningful. I am not going to tell it that way, because what happened to Nia in the foster system was not a backdrop. It was her life, and she lived every single day of it. She moved twice in the first year. The first home was not unkind. It was simply overwhelmed. For children, 2 adults, not enough hours in the day for anyone's needs to be fully met. And Nia, even at 6, had needs that were not simple. She was observant in a way that made adults uncomfortable. She noticed things. She remembered things. She asked questions that were too precise for a child her age. And the adults around her didn't always know whether to be impressed or unsettled, and they usually landed on unsettled. The second home lasted 14 months. She was removed after she reported, accurately, with a level of detail that the caseworker described as remarkable, that the foster father was systematically manipulating the younger children in the house through a pattern of conditional affection designed to ensure their silence. She was 7 years old. She had no framework for what she was describing. She just knew it was wrong. She just saw it. That is the thing about children who grow up having to read rooms in order to feel safe. They become extraordinarily good at reading rooms. It is a survival skill that the circumstances made necessary. After the second home, Nia was in a transitional placement, a short-term facility while the system worked out what came next. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. She had taken a paper bag from the convenience store next door and a pen that was running out of ink, and she had gone to sit in the alley because the facility was loud and the alley was quiet, and she had always needed quiet the way other people needed noise. She was drawing a house. It had windows. It had a path leading to the front. It had a tree in the yard that was slightly too large for the proportions of the house, which she knew but kept anyway because she liked the way it looked. And it had a door. Left open. Just slightly. That is when the footsteps stopped at the entrance of the alley. That is when she looked up. 2 people. Both of them abandoned. In completely different languages. In completely different worlds. Standing 12 feet apart in an alley in Los Angeles on a Tuesday evening in October. Neither of them knowing yet what the other one was. Neither of them knowing yet what the other one was about to become. He looked at her drawing. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he asked, in English that was careful and accented and precise, what she was drawing. She told him. He looked at the open door. He asked why it was open, and she said, without looking up, "So whoever left knows they can come back." Seo Jinho stood in that alley for a long time after that. Let's be precise about what happened next, because this is the part of the story that people want to make simple. They want it to be a gesture, a grand, clean, cinematic moment where a powerful man sees a child and opens his heart, and the world rearranges itself accordingly. It wasn't like that. It was never like that. Jinho didn't make a decision in the alley. Not consciously. Not with the deliberate architecture he applied to every significant move in his professional life. The assessment of variables, the mapping of consequences, the cold-eyed calculation of risk against return. He sat down. That was all. He sat down on the ground next to a 7-year-old girl in an alley in Los Angeles, in his dress clothes, in the dirt, and he looked at what she was drawing. She didn't ask him who he was. She didn't ask him why he was sitting in an alley in a suit. She turned the paper bag slightly so he could see the full drawing, the way you turn something towards someone when you want them to have a better view. And she kept working on the tree that was too large for the proportions, and she hummed something under her breath, a melody she was clearly constructing in real time, adjusting it, discarding notes and retrieving them. He sat there for 40 minutes. He didn't speak much. She didn't either. But when a caseworker from the facility came looking for her and found her in the alley with a stranger and moved immediately toward alarm, Nia said, before anyone else could speak, "He's okay. He's just sad. Just sad. Not dangerous. Not suspicious. Not unknown. Just sad." She had read him in 40 minutes more accurately than people who had known him for decades. He went to his meeting. He sat in a room with men who controlled significant portions of money and geography, and he said the right things and made the right agreements, and not one person in that room would have known, looking at him, that anything had changed. But something had changed. He could feel it the way you feel a structural shift before you can see it, in the quality of the silence around a decision that hasn't been made yet, but is already inevitable. He called his lawyer from the car. He asked a single question. He listened to the answer. He said, "Find out what it takes." The legal process took 8 months. It required exceptional lawyers and deliberate management of his professional history. He appeared, in every document and every interview, as exactly what was required. None of it was false. That is the part that matters. But his people didn't see it that way. His lieutenants heard about it in stages, the way people in closed organizations always hear things, in fragments that accumulate into a picture nobody wants to be looking at. First, that he had made inquiries about a child in Los Angeles. Second, that those inquiries had become legal proceedings. Third, that the child was 7 years old, American, and black. The reactions were not uniform. Some were confused. Some were quietly dismissive, a grief response. They told themselves, something that would pass once he was back inside the rhythm of his ordinary life. But Cheon came to him directly. He closed the door. He sat across from Jinho with the careful, measured expression of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say and is now deciding, in real time, how much of the rehearsal to use. He said, "She will be used against you." Not a warning. A decision already made, wearing the clothes of a warning. Jinho looked at him for a long moment. And then he said something that Cheon would think about for the next 16 years, that would calcify, slowly, into the specific resentment that eventually became betrayal. He said, "Everything I have ever loved has already been used against me. This time, I choose what I love anyway." Within weeks, without Jinho's knowledge, Cheon made a call to Busan. Not to threaten. Not yet. Just to open a door. Just to let them know that there might, in time, be something worth discussing. He told himself it was precautionary. He told himself he was protecting the organization. He had already stopped being able to tell the difference. There are sentences that people say that they don't fully understand, yet when they are saying them. Sentences that are truer than the moment they are spoken in. Sentences that only reveal their full meaning in retrospect. That was one of them. Nia arrived in Seoul shortly after. She was 7 years old and she had one bag, and she sat in the back of the car from the airport with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked out the window at a city that was nothing like any city she had ever seen, and she didn't cry and she didn't ask questions. She watched. She absorbed. She processed in that deep, unhurried, total way that had always made the adults around her uneasy. The house Jinho had prepared for her was not extravagant in the way of performance. It was simply considered. Someone had thought about what a child needed. There was a room with natural light. There were books in English. There was space. She walked through it slowly. She touched things with the careful, provisional quality of someone who has learned not to unpack completely, because unpacking completely is a form of trust that experience has not yet justified. She stopped in the doorway of her room. She stood there for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at Jinho, who was standing in the hallway, who had been watching her move through the house with an expression he couldn't entirely control, something between hope and terror. And she said, "Are you going to send me back?" He crouched down so he was at her eye level. He said, "No." She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the alley, steadily, completely, without flinching. Then she nodded, once, and walked into her room. She didn't believe him yet. That part is important. She heard him. She registered the word. But a child who has been left enough times doesn't believe in words. She believed in patterns. And the pattern hadn't been established yet. So she waited. The way she had always waited. Watching. Measuring. Keeping the verdict open. What followed was not a fairy tale. I want to be clear about that. Because the version of this story that makes it a fairy tale does both of them a disservice. It flattens them into symbols, the generous man, the grateful child, and removes the thing that actually makes this story worth telling, which is the difficulty, the real, daily, unromantic difficulty of two people who had both been shaped by abandonment trying to build something neither of them had a working model for. Nia woke up screaming twice a week for the first 4 months. Not every night. Not predictably. Just, suddenly, at 2 or 3 in the morning, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than sleep. Jinho was always there within 30 seconds. He was a man who had built his entire life on knowing what to do, and he stood in the doorway of her room at 3 in the morning without a script. So he just stayed. He sat in the chair near the door, and he stayed until the breathing steadied and the room became safe again. He never made her explain it. He never asked what the dream was. He just stayed. She tested him. Methodically. Comprehensively. With the thoroughness of someone conducting a study whose results actually matter. She broke things. Not in rage but in calibration. Watching his face as she did it to see if the face changed. If the warmth behind the eyes had a limit she could locate. She was late home from school on purpose. 4 times in the first 3 months. To see whether the response was anger or relief. It was always relief. She told him once, flatly, over dinner, that she didn't love him and wasn't sure she ever would. He said, "That's okay. I'm not going anywhere in the meantime." Every act of disruption was a question she didn't have words for yet. Are you real? Are you staying? Is this the time you leave? Is this the thing that finally makes you decide I'm too much? Jinho answered every question she didn't ask. Not with speeches. Not with declarations. With consistency. He drove her to school every morning. Every morning. Regardless of what the night had required of him. Regardless of what was happening in the world, he kept entirely separate from her. She would come downstairs and he would be there, car keys in hand, coffee in the other, already knowing whether she wanted to talk or sit in silence for the drive because he had learned the difference. He attended every school meeting. He learned her favorite meal, a specific combination she had invented herself, not something from a recipe, something entirely her own, and he made sure it was available when she had a difficult week. He learned to distinguish between the silence that meant she was fine and the silence that meant she was drowning, because they were not the same silence and most people never bothered to learn the difference. The greatest healers in our lives are rarely the ones we expected. Sometimes they are the people we thought we were helping, who quietly, without announcement, spend years healing us back. Because here is what Nia did for Jinho. Without a curriculum. Without intending it. Without even knowing, for years, that it was happening. She taught him that consistency is its own language. She taught him that a person can be soft in some places and structurally unbreakable in others, and that these things are not contradictions. She taught him that the difference between authority and control is whether the people beneath you have a choice. And she taught him, slowly, across years, in increments so small they were almost invisible, how to feel things again. Not dramatically. Not in any moment that announced itself as significant. In small, ordinary moments. The first time he laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly, at something she said at breakfast, he stopped afterward and sat very still. She looked at him from across the table. She didn't say anything. She just smiled and went back to her food. The anniversary of his wife's death came every November. The third year, Nia was 10 years old. She found him in the study at midnight, sitting at his desk with nothing in front of him. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in, and she sat down in the chair across from him, and she put her small hand over his large one on the desk. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't offer words. She just stayed. She was 10 years old, and she didn't look frightened. She looked like someone doing something important. He cried that night. For the first time since the hospital corridor. He didn't try to stop it. He didn't leave the room. He sat at his desk with his daughter's hand over his, and he let the grief that had been calcifying for 3 years finally move. Nia sat with him until it was finished. But who she was becoming. That is the entire reason this story doesn't end in collapse. By the time Nia was 12, her Korean was fluent. Not functional. Not conversational in the careful, grammatically approximate way of someone working through a second language with effort and goodwill. Fluent. The kind of fluent that happens when a child's brain, still plastic, still hungry, still fundamentally organized around absorption, is immersed completely in a language and decides, without consulting anyone, to simply make it native. Her teachers noticed within the first year that she didn't just learn Korean. She learned how Koreans said things. The architecture of implication and indirection. The precise social weight of what gets left out of a sentence versus what gets put in. The difference between what a room full of people was saying and what the room full of people actually meant. She understood subtext before she fully understood context. And that distinction, that gap between what is said and what is true, had always been where Nia lived most naturally. Children who grow up having to read the emotional temperature of every room they enter, in order to feel safe, in order to anticipate, in order to survive, develop a particular kind of intelligence. It doesn't show up on standard assessments. It doesn't fit neatly into any category that institutional systems know how to reward. But it is real, and it is precise, and in the right circumstances, it becomes extraordinary. By 14 she had added Japanese, not because anyone suggested it, because she had decided, on her own, that the organizations Jinho dealt with occasionally had Japanese components, and she wanted to understand what was being said in rooms she wasn't supposed to be in. She was 14. She hadn't been told to do this. She simply noticed a gap in her knowledge and closed it. By 16 she had taught herself to play 4 instruments by ear, not because she was pursuing music, but because she had discovered early that learning something by ear rather than by notation required her to develop a quality of attention. The kind that doesn't rush toward the answer but sits with the pattern until the pattern reveals itself. She applied that quality of attention to everything. She was also suspended twice before she finished secondary school, both times for the same essential reason, wearing different clothes. The first time, she stood up in the middle of a class and told a teacher, calmly, with the measured delivery of someone who has prepared their remarks, that he had been systematically crediting the ideas of male students when they were demonstrably the contributions of female ones, and that she had 3 weeks of documented examples if he wanted to review them. She had the documentation, in a folder, which she placed on his desk. The second time, she publicly and methodically dismantled a narrative that a school administrator had constructed to protect a student from a wealthy family at the expense of a student from a poor one. Again, documented. Again, accurate. Again, delivered with a composure that the adults involved found significantly more unsettling than anger would have been. Jinho received both calls from the school. After the first one, he sat across from her that evening and looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Was everything you said accurate?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Did you have the evidence before you spoke?" She said, "Always." He nodded. He said, "Next time, give them a private opportunity to correct it before you go public." Not because the public correction was wrong. Because he was teaching her the difference between being right and being effective. She understood the distinction immediately. She didn't always agree with it, but she understood it. That was the texture of their relationship by the time she was a teenager. Not a father who softened her. Not a daughter who simply absorbed his lessons. 2 people, genuinely different in temperament, in generation, in the shape of their damage, thinking at each other, disagreeing with complete respect. Neither of them pretending the other one was something they weren't. But the world Nia moved through was not neutral about who she was. And this story doesn't earn its honesty by skipping that. She was stared at. In school, in social situations, in the carefully curated environments of Jinho's legitimate social world. The dinners, the events, the spaces where powerful people performed their relationships with each other. She was stared at with a consistency that never fully normalized no matter how many years passed. She was tested. Her Korean was questioned by people whose faces made clear they had decided the answer before she spoke. Her intelligence was received with a particular variety of surprise that is its own form of insult. The kind that dresses itself as a compliment and expects gratitude. She was occasionally asked, by adults who considered themselves sophisticated, where she was really from. She always answered the same way. She named the neighborhood in Chicago where she was born, the street, the hospital. Then she waited, with that steady, unblinking composure that she had been developing since she was 7 years old in an alley with a broken pen. She never explained herself further. She had decided, at some point, that she couldn't precisely locate, that she was not available for the kind of explanation that required her to make someone else comfortable with her own existence. There is a particular exhaustion that belongs to people who move through spaces that were not built with them in mind. It is not dramatic. It is not the exhaustion of a single confrontation or a single injustice. It is the exhaustion of perpetual calibration. Nia never tried to belong anywhere. That is the thing that most people who observed her from the outside misread as coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was a decision. So she stopped trying to belong and started trying to understand. Every environment she entered, she studied, not with detachment, with intense, genuine curiosity about how things worked, why people made the choices they made, what the structures beneath the visible structures were, what was being protected and what was being sacrificed and by whom and for what reason. She became, by the time she was 17, one of the most perceptive readers of human systems that Jinho had ever encountered. And he had encountered many. He told her that once. Not as a compliment, exactly. As an observation. The way he stated most true things, flatly, without embellishment, because he had never seen the point of decorating facts. She said, "I learned it from watching you." He said, "I learned it from surviving." She said, "Same thing." She found out the truth at 17. Not because he told her unprompted. Not because she discovered something she wasn't supposed to find. Because she asked. Directly. Over dinner. On an ordinary Tuesday evening with nothing particular to mark it as the night this conversation would happen. She put down her chopsticks. She looked at him. And she said, "Tell me what you actually do." The room went very still. Jinho looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the careful architecture he had constructed over 10 years to keep her world separate from his. The deliberate compartmentalization. The legitimate businesses that formed the visible surface. The staff who had standing instructions never to discuss certain things in her presence. He had built a wall, and she had walked through it without any apparent effort, and was now sitting on the other side of it, waiting. He told her the truth. All of it. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat with it. Not for minutes, for 3 days. She went to school. She came home. She ate dinner. She was present and functional and gave nothing away. On the 3rd day she came and found him in the study. She sat down. She said, "You have never lied to me. Not once. In 10 years. You have kept things from me. That's different. Keeping things from me was a decision I can understand even when I don't agree with it. But you have never lied to me. That is the only reason I'm still sitting here." He didn't respond immediately. When he did, he said, "I know what I am. I have always known. I never wanted it to touch you." She said, "It already touched me. It's been touching me for 10 years. I just didn't have the full picture." She leaned forward. "I'd rather have the full picture." That sentence, that quiet, completely unambiguous sentence, is the one that changes everything that comes after. Because a person who wants the full picture, who refuses the comfortable, edited version of reality in favor of the complete and difficult one, is a person who cannot be manipulated, cannot be turned, cannot be used against the thing they love, because they have already looked at the thing they love clearly, all of it, and chosen it anyway. She left for London at 21, a strategic analysis position at an international consulting firm, a role she had pursued herself, through her own application, without Jinho's intervention. She had been specific about that. She needed to build something that was entirely her own. Something that existed because of her capability and not because of his reach. He understood. He didn't interfere. He drove her to the airport. They stood at the departure gate, and he was not a man who performed emotion in public, and she was not a woman who required him to. And so they stood for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have already said everything that matters and are now just present with each other before the distance begins. She hugged him. He held on longer than he meant to. She pulled back and looked at him. She said, "I'll call on Sundays." He said, "I know." She called every Sunday for 2 years. Without exception. The few times she had been back in those 2 years, brief visits, holidays, long weekends, she had noticed Cheon moving through Jinho's world with the ease of a man who had decided something and was waiting for the right moment to act on it. She couldn't have named it then. She filed it the way she filed everything, without pressure, without conclusion. Just noted. She was 23 when she came home for a long weekend in late autumn. The city was cold in the way Seoul gets cold. Not gradual, not negotiable, just suddenly and completely itself. She arrived on a Friday. By Saturday evening she was sitting at a dinner table watching Cheon, Jinho's oldest enforcer, the man who had been there from the beginning, since Incheon, since the years before the organization had a name, and something was wrong. She couldn't name it yet. It was in the space between his sentences. In the quality of his attention when Jinho mentioned a particular asset restructuring that was happening in the next quarter. In the way his eyes moved, not toward the information being discussed, but toward something he was privately calculating. She knew that look. She had been studying that look, in various faces, in various rooms, across various contexts, for her entire life. It was the look of someone who has already made a decision and is managing the performance of not having made it yet. She said nothing at the table. She finished dinner. She helped clear the dishes. She waited until she and Jinho were alone, until the house had settled into its late-night quiet and the staff had withdrawn and it was just the two of them the way it used to be, years ago, before London, before the distance, and she said, "Cheon is lying to you." She said it the way she said true things, without drama, without hedging. He has been for a while. I don't know the full shape of it yet, but I know what someone looks like when they've already chosen a side and they are still pretending they haven't. And I have known that look since I was 6 years old. Jinho looked at her. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't ask how she could be certain. He had watched her red rooms for years. He knew what her certainty looked like. He knew the difference between her guessing and her knowing. This was knowing. She had to decide, not whether she loved him enough to help, but whether she loved herself enough to do it on her own terms. Let's talk about what loyalty actually is. Not the word, not the concept as it gets deployed in movies and speeches, and the carefully constructed mythology of powerful organizations. The real thing. What it actually costs. What it actually requires. What it looks like when it has been maintained for decades. And what it looks like when it finally breaks. Seo Jinho had built his entire world on a single premise. That loyalty was not a feeling. It was a practice. It was the daily, unglamorous, unrewarded choice to honor your word when honoring it was inconvenient. To protect what you said you would protect. To remain accountable to the structure of your commitments even when the structure no longer served you personally. He had practiced it without exception for 30 years. And he had selected, promoted, and trusted only the people he believed practiced it the same way. He was wrong about one of them. Cheon Moojin had been with Jinho since Incheon. Since before the organization had a name. Since the years when they were both young men running errands for older men and learning, in the accelerated and unforgiving way of that environment, how power actually moved. He had been Jinho's first lieutenant, his most trusted enforcer, the person who, for 30 years, had been in every significant room, at every significant table, present for every major decision. He knew everything, not because he had stolen the information, because Jinho had given it to him freely. Because that is what trust does. It opens doors. And the thing about opening doors for people is that you cannot control, afterward, what they decide to walk through. The fracture didn't begin with greed. That is the part that takes a moment to absorb. Because greed is comprehensible. Greed has a logic that, even when you find it reprehensible, you can follow. You can trace the line from want to action and understand, if not forgive, the sequence. This was not greed. This was ideology. He had grown up in a world where softness was what you buried people in, where the men who lasted were the ones who had cut that part of themselves off early and never looked back. Jinho had been one of those men. And then he wasn't. And Cheon had never found a way to forgive him for it. Cheon had watched Jinho change. Not suddenly. Not in any single moment that announced itself. But across years. Across the accumulation of small shifts that, taken individually, seemed unremarkable, and taken together formed a portrait of a man who was no longer entirely who he had been. He had watched Jinho bring a child into the organization's orbit. An outsider. An American. A black girl from Chicago with no connection to their world, their culture, their history. He had watched Jinho restructure his schedule around school meetings and dinner times and the ordinary domestic rhythm of raising a child. He had watched Jinho laugh at a breakfast table. He had watched Jinho cry. And something in Cheon, something that had been quietly accumulating across those years the way resentment accumulates, in layers too thin to notice until they are suddenly too thick to ignore, had decided that what he was watching was not growth. It was contamination. There are people in our lives who cannot tolerate our healing. Not because they are evil. Not because they wish us harm in any simple, legible way. But because our transformation, our softening, our expansion, our willingness to become more than we were, quietly and devastatingly exposes the places where they have refused to grow. When you change, some people celebrate it. And some people experience it as a verdict on their own stagnation. And the ones who experience it as a verdict, sometimes they decide to punish you for it. He didn't see it as change. He saw it as loss. Cheon believed, genuinely, with the conviction of a man who had constructed a complete internal justification, that Jinho had been weakened. That the adoption of Nia had introduced a vulnerability into the organization that would eventually be exploited by someone. That if he didn't act, someone else would. He had decided, somewhere in the middle of year 13 or 14, he couldn't have told you precisely when the decision fully formed, because that is how these decisions work. They accumulate rather than arrive, that the organization needed to be reclaimed. Returned to what it had been before sentiment entered the equation. Before a 7-year-old girl with a paper bag changed the man at the center of everything. The mechanics of what he built were precise. He had spent 3 years constructing it. Quietly. In the margins of his legitimate responsibilities. In conversations that looked like ordinary operational discussions. In relationships with the Busan faction that appeared, on the surface, to be the routine management of interorganizational diplomacy. He had redirected funds. Not dramatically. Not in the kind of movement that triggers immediate detection, but in the patient, incremental way of someone who understands that the best financial manipulation is the kind that stays below the threshold of scrutiny for long enough to become structural. He had cultivated loyalty in the layer of people directly beneath Jinho's most trusted circle, the second tier, the people whose ambitions had been patient but not dormant, by offering them a version of the future that was simpler, cleaner, more aligned with what the organization had been before it became complicated. Cheon had positioned 3 of Jinho's remaining loyal lieutenants as unwitting shields, people whose continued visible loyalty to Jinho made the internal structure look stable from the outside while the inside was being systematically hollowed. And he had done all of it while continuing to sit at Jinho's table, while continuing to receive Jinho's trust, while continuing to be, in every visible and measurable way, exactly who he had always been. The most devastating betrayals in history have never come from enemies. Enemies you watch. Enemies you prepare for. Enemies exist at a distance that allows you to maintain your defenses. The ones who destroy you are the ones who were inside the defenses, who knew the codes, who understood the silences, who had been trusted with the complete and unguarded version of you. Because you loved them. Because you believed the love was mutual. Because 30 years of shared history felt like proof. Jinho didn't see it. That is the truth that this story doesn't flinch from. The man who had built an empire on his ability to read people, who had spent 30 years developing an almost architectural understanding of human motivation and loyalty and the ways that power corrupts the people who carry it, did not see this coming. Not because he was careless. Not because his instincts had failed him. But because Cheon was not a stranger performing loyalty. He was a man who had practiced it genuinely for decades before he stopped. And there is no surveillance system sophisticated enough to detect the exact moment a loyal person decides to become something else. There is only, in retrospect, the accumulation of moments that looked like nothing at the time. The Busan faction had been waiting for an opening for 11 years. They had tried twice before, through direct confrontation, through the kind of overt power challenge that Jinho's organization had met and absorbed without significant disruption. They had learned from those attempts. They had stopped trying to break through the wall, and started looking for someone who already had a key. Cheon gave them the key. Not all at once. In installments. In the patient, graduated way of a man who understood that the value of what he was offering would only be recognized if it was delivered carefully, if it was presented not as desperation but as strategy. In exchange, control of 3 of Jinho's primary revenue structures after the transition. A guarantee of his own position in the new architecture. And, this is the detail that reveals everything about the nature of the betrayal, a formal agreement that the organization would return to its pre-adoption operational philosophy. That Nia would be removed from any proximity to the organization's affairs. That the softness would be extracted. That the thing Jinho had chosen over empire would be taken from him before the empire itself was. He wasn't just trying to take the organization. He was trying to erase the evidence that love had ever been inside it. He was trying to make Jinho into the man he had been before that alley in Los Angeles, before the girl with the broken pen. He was trying to prove, to himself, more than anyone, that years of change had been an aberration. That the real Jinho was the one from Incheon, the one Cheon recognized. Because he had made the same mistake that people make when they watch someone grow and refuse to believe the growth is real. He had been watching Jinho change for 16 years, and he had completely failed to watch Nia. She had been in Seoul for less than 2 days when she sat across the dinner table from him. She had been observing him for approximately 40 minutes, and she had already seen enough. Not the details, not the architecture of what he had built, not the financial structures or the Busan agreements or the names of the people in the second tier who had been quietly turned, but the thing underneath all of those details. The quality of attention that belongs to a person who is managing the performance of loyalty while no longer practicing it. She had first learned to recognize that quality at 6 years old. In a foster home. In an adult whose performance of safety was meticulous and whose actual intentions were not. She had been reading that register of human behavior for 17 years before she sat across from Cheon at a dinner table in Seoul. She saw it in the pause before he answered a question about the asset restructuring. Not the length of the pause, the texture of it. The way it lasted a fraction of a second longer than genuine uncertainty and a fraction of a second shorter than deliberate evasion. The middle ground of a man who knows the answer and is deciding, in real time, which version of it to give. She saw it in the direction of his eyes when Jinho mentioned a specific number, not toward Jinho, not toward the information, but inward. The micro-movement of a person doing a rapid private calculation. She saw it in the quality of his stillness when the conversation moved to a topic she would later identify as directly adjacent to the compromised structures. The stillness of someone who has learned to make the body do nothing when the mind is doing everything. She had that skill herself. She recognized it immediately. After dinner, after the house had settled, she found Jinho alone. She told him what she had seen. Not what she suspected. Not what she felt. What she had seen. Accurately. With the measured, evidence-first delivery of someone who had learned, from a man who built an empire on it, that the difference between being right and being believed is almost always in the quality of the evidence. Jinho listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was very quiet. He looked at her, this woman who had been a 7-year-old girl with a broken pen, who had grown into someone who could walk into a room and see the thing that 30 years of professional vigilance had missed. And he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "How long?" She said, "Long enough that the structure is already compromised. Long enough that it won't be simple." She leaned forward, "But not long enough that it can't be answered. If we move correctly. And if you let me help." That last sentence, that quiet claim on the right to stand inside what was happening, was the moment the story shifted. Because Jinho's instinct, the instinct of a man who had spent 16 years building a wall between his daughter and his world, was to say no. To protect her. To handle it himself. To keep the separation intact. But she was already inside it. She had always been inside it. Not because he had brought her in, but because love, real love, the chosen and practiced and daily kind, does not produce bystanders. It produces people who show up, whether you ask them to or not. She had a life, a real one, built on her own terms. Walking back into it was not a simple thing. She didn't say yes immediately. That matters, because the version of this story that makes Nia a symbol, a loyal daughter who rushes without hesitation toward the man who saved her, misses the entire point of who she had become. She was not a symbol. She was a person with a life in London that she had built from nothing, built from her own capability, her own work, with no connection to Jinho's name. She had an apartment she had chosen herself, colleagues she had earned, a version of her days that belonged entirely to her. And she had spent enough of her life in spaces that weren't built for her to understand, deeply and without romanticism, what it meant to finally be inside one that was. She went for a walk. 3 hours. Through Seoul at 2 in the morning. The city at that hour has a particular quality, not empty, never fully empty, but quieter than itself. The neon still running, but the noise pulled back. The streets wet from an earlier rain. The kind of night that doesn't push you toward anything, that just holds the space open. She walked without destination. She let the question move through her without trying to resolve it prematurely. She stopped at the park near her old school. She sat on the same bench she had sat on at 14, at 16, in the various difficult seasons of growing up in a city that was and was not hers. She thought about London. She thought about what she would be walking away from, even temporarily, and whether temporarily was a word she could trust in this context, or whether it was the kind of word people use when they don't want to look directly at what they are actually deciding. She thought about Jinho. Not the abstract version. Not the mythology of him. The daily, unglamorous reality of him. The man who sat in the doorway of her room at 3 in the morning without a script. The man who learned the difference between her silences. The man who told her the complete truth when she asked for it and never once asked her to be smaller than she was. She thought about the paper bag, the house with the door left open, and she thought about what it meant, what it had always meant, that she had drawn it that way. So whoever left knows they can come back. She came back. Not to Jinho's world. On her own terms. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction was not negotiable. She sat across from him the following morning, and she laid out the conditions before she laid out anything else. She would not carry a weapon. She would not operate inside the organizational structure. She was not a lieutenant. She was not an asset. She was not a tool to be deployed. She would do what she did, what she had always done, what she was, in fact, professionally trained and personally constituted to do better than anyone else in that world. She would observe. She would analyze. She would map. And she would give Jinho the complete picture, every detail, every connection, every structural vulnerability that Cheon had created and every leverage point that could be used to dismantle it. She was not deciding for him. That is what love looks like when it is practiced correctly. They don't rescue you by replacing your judgment with theirs. They stand next to you with the full information, and they trust you to be capable of what comes next. She began the same day. And what she did over the following 2 weeks, in the quiet, the patience, the methodical construction of a complete intelligence picture using tools that had nothing to do with the organization's infrastructure and everything to do with her own, was extraordinary. Not because it was dramatic. Because it wasn't. She started with the financial architecture. She was, professionally, someone who understood how organizations moved money, how the visible flows related to the invisible ones, where the pressure points were, what patterns of behavior looked like when they were designed to evade rather than report. She requested access to 3 years of legitimate business records under the cover of helping Jinho restructure his legal holdings, a request that raised no flags because it was entirely consistent with what a daughter with a professional background might reasonably do. She spent 4 days inside those records. She didn't look for the obvious. She looked for the rhythm, the cadence of normal versus the cadence of managed, the places where the numbers were too clean, where the variance was too consistent, where someone had been very careful in the way that only happens when someone has something to be careful about. She found 3 separate channels, all of them operating below the threshold that would have triggered internal review, all of them patient, long-running, structured to look, in any individual quarter, like ordinary operational fluctuation. Together, across 36 months, they amounted to a transfer of organizational capital significant enough to fund an entire parallel infrastructure. She documented everything, not in the organization's systems, in her own, encrypted, completely external, completely hers. Then she moved to the people. This was the part that required a different kind of skill. Not analysis, observation. She spent a week moving through Jinho's world in the way she had always moved through rooms. Attending the meals, the meetings, the ordinary social occasions that punctuated the organization's life. Being present. Being quiet. Being, to everyone who looked at her, simply Jinho's daughter, home for an extended visit, unremarkable in her presence and therefore invisible in her attention. She watched the second tier. The people Cheon had cultivated. She watched how they positioned themselves in rooms relative to Cheon versus relative to Jinho. She watched who deferred to whom on which topics. She watched the social choreography of people who are managing two simultaneous allegiances and have not yet been required to choose openly between them. She identified 7 people. 3 of them she assessed as genuinely turned, committed to Cheon's vision, aware of the full scope of what was being built. 4 of them she assessed as compromised but not committed, people who had been offered something and had not said no, but who had also not fully said yes. People who were waiting to see how the weight distributed before they put themselves on a side. The 3 were a problem. The 4 were an opportunity. She mapped the Busan connection last. This was the most delicate part. The part that required her to move into territory she had no direct access to and construct a picture from adjacent information, from the patterns in the financial records, from the timing of certain meetings that appeared in legitimate calendars, from a single conversation she overheard between 2 people who had no idea she understood every word. She built the connection from the outside in, like reconstructing an architecture from its shadows. When she was finished, she had a document. 41 pages. Complete. Sourced. Cross-referenced. A full accounting of what Cheon had built, how he had built it, who was involved, what they had been promised, and, most importantly, where the structural vulnerabilities were. The places where the conspiracy could be exposed, the allegiances could be separated, the damage could be contained. She gave it to Jinho on a Thursday evening. She put it on the desk in front of him, and she sat across from him while he read it. It took him 2 hours. When he finished, he closed the document. He sat very still in the way she had learned to recognize, not the stillness of calm but the stillness of someone absorbing something that requires the whole body to process. He said, "How?" She said, "The same way you taught me to read a room." I just never stopped. There is something that happens when a parent sees their child use something they gave them. Not a possession. Not money or opportunity or connection. Something interior. A way of moving through the world. A capacity that was built inside the relationship and now exists independently of it. It is one of the most irreplaceable feelings available to a human being. And Jinho sat across from his daughter in that study on a Thursday evening and felt it completely. He wanted to handle the rest himself. Of course he did. He was 56 years old, and he had been handling things himself since he was 14, and the instinct was structural. It was not something he could simply decide not to have. He told her that she had done enough. That what she had given him was everything he needed. That he would take it from here. She let him finish. Then she said, "I want to be in the room." He said, "Nia." She said, "I have been in this family for 16 years. I have never asked you for anything that belonged to your world. I am asking for this. Not because I need to see it. Because Cheon needs to." Jinho looked at her for a long time. He thought about the 14-year-old who had placed a folder on a teacher's desk. He thought about the 17-year-old who had sat across from him and said, "I'd rather have the full picture." He thought about the woman sitting across from him now, who had built her own life, on her own terms, and had walked back into the most dangerous room of his world anyway because she had decided that love, practiced correctly, does not produce bystanders. He said, "You stay next to me." She said, "I know where I stand." The meeting was called under the pretense of a routine strategic review. Cheon arrived with the composed, careful bearing of a man who has no idea the room has changed. That is the thing about people who believe they are the most perceptive person in any given situation. They stop checking. Jinho laid out the document methodically. Not theatrically. Not with the performance of betrayed emotion that the moment might have invited. Methodically. The financial channels. The Busan agreements. The names. The timeline. The promises that had been made to the second tier and the people who had accepted them. Cheon's composure held for approximately 4 minutes. Then it began to fracture, not in the obvious way, not in any single visible expression, but in the quality of his stillness. It became effortful. The way stillness becomes when it is being maintained against pressure rather than arising naturally from calm. He looked across the table at Jinho. And then, and this was the moment that Nia had asked to be present for, his eyes moved to her. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with the barely contained contempt of a man who had spent 16 years believing she was the evidence of Jinho's weakness. She looked back at him, steadily, without heat, without triumph, without any of the emotions that the moment might have been expected to produce in a person who had just helped dismantle a conspiracy that was partially designed to erase her from this world. Just looked at him and said, "You spent 20 years believing I made him weak. You built all of this because you believed that. I need you to understand something before this conversation ends." She leaned forward very slightly. "I am the one who found you." The room was very quiet after that. Cheon looked at her for a long moment, and in his face, something moved. He looked, for just a moment, at the document. Not at Jinho. At the document. The way a person looks at the thing that proves them wrong. Not about the tactics, but about everything underneath them. He had been watching Jinho change for 16 years, and he had completely failed to watch Nia. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Cheon didn't speak again. The conspiracy dissolved the way it had been built, quietly, in private rooms, over 11 days. The 3 fully committed to Cheon were removed. The 4 who had been compromised but not committed were offered a choice. What they had been given in exchange for their silence would be returned if they returned their loyalty. 3 of the 4 took it. The Busan faction, presented with the evidence and the clear demonstration that their inside architecture no longer existed, retreated. And then it was over. The night it ended, Jinho and Nia were alone. The house had the particular stillness of a space that has been through something and is now resting. The staff had withdrawn. The calls had stopped. The organizational machinery that had been running at high intensity for nearly 2 weeks had gone quiet. He suggested the roof. She hadn't been up there in years. It was cold in the way Seoul gets cold in late autumn, complete and unapologetic, the kind of cold that makes the city look cleaner than it is, that sharpens the edges of things and makes the lights across the skyline appear closer than the distance warrants. They stood side by side at the railing, neither of them speaking immediately. The silence between them had never been uncomfortable. From the very beginning, from an alley in Los Angeles where a man in a suit sat down next to a child with a broken pen, and neither of them felt the need to fill the space with words. Silence had been one of the primary languages of their relationship. It was still that. It was still the place where the truest things between them lived. He spoke first. Not with the preamble that people use when they are working towards something difficult. Not with the careful approach of a man managing how a conversation will land. Directly. The way he had always spoken to her once he had decided she deserved the complete truth. He said, "The night I sat next to you in that alley, I wasn't looking for a daughter." He looked out at the city. "I didn't know what I was looking for. I'm not sure I was looking for anything. I think I was just moving. Because moving was the only thing I knew how to do that wasn't standing still inside what had happened." He paused. "But your eyes had something in them I hadn't seen in years. You weren't afraid of me." He turned to look at her. "I couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at me without fear. And I sat down because I didn't know what else to do with that." Nia looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back out at the city. She said, "I was afraid. A beat. I was absolutely afraid. You were a very large, very hollow-looking stranger who appeared at the entrance of an alley where I was alone at night." She said it without humor but without gravity either. Just the fact. But I had already learned by then that being afraid of something and deciding it was worth being afraid for were 2 different calculations. She paused. "You looked like someone who had lost something that couldn't be replaced. I knew what that looked like. It looked like someone worth sitting still for." The city held them for a moment. The lights. The cold. The irreplaceable texture of a place that had become home not through birth or design, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary days that added up, without announcement, into a life. Then she said something she hadn't planned to say. It arrived the way true things sometimes arrive, not constructed but surfaced, from somewhere below the level of deliberate thought. She said, "I used to sit at my window the first year. At night when I couldn't sleep. And I would look at this city and I would think, I don't know if this is home or if this is just the next place. I had learned not to decide too quickly. Because deciding too quickly and being wrong was worse than not deciding at all. She was quiet for a moment. It took me a long time to stop thinking of it as the next place. Jinho said, "When did it stop?" She thought about it. Genuinely. Not reaching for the answer that would land well but actually locating the memory. She said, "The night you sat in the doorway of my room. The third time. I woke up from a nightmare and you were already there before I had fully surfaced from it. You were already in the doorway. And I realized, you hadn't waited to hear the sound and then come. You had just learned when I needed you before I made a sound. I didn't tell you that it changed something. But it did. That was when I stopped thinking of it as the next place." Jinho didn't respond immediately. He stood at the railing with his hands folded in front of him, and he looked at the city and he let the weight of what she had said exist without rushing to diminish it with a response. He said, after a long time, "I told myself, in the beginning, that I was doing something for you." He said it carefully. The way people say things they have wanted to examine for a long time and are only now allowing themselves to look at directly. That you were the one who needed a home, stability, someone to stay. I believed that. I'm not sure it was wrong exactly. But it was incomplete. He looked at her. You gave me back something I had decided I was finished with. I didn't know that's what was happening. I wouldn't have had the language for it if you'd asked me at the time. But somewhere in the middle of learning, when your silences were different from each other, somewhere in the middle of driving you to school and sitting in rooms with teachers and watching you place a folder on a desk and look at an adult like you were the only person in the room who understood what was actually happening. He stopped. I started to feel like a person again. Not a position. Not a structure. Not the sum of 30 years of decisions. A person. You did that. A 7-year-old girl with a broken pen and a paper bag did that. Nia didn't say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was even, unhurried. The voice of someone who has learned that the most important things don't require volume. She said, "You stayed. That's all I needed you to do. I know it didn't feel like all. I know I made it as difficult as I possibly could." She paused. But staying was everything. It was the only thing I had ever actually needed from anyone. And you did it every single time. Without making me feel like a burden for needing it. Without making me earn it. Without conditions. She turned to look at him fully. Do you understand how rare that is? Do you understand that most people spend their entire lives never experiencing that even once? And you just did it. Because you decided to. In an alley. In Los Angeles. In your worst moment. You decided. Let's talk about what actually happened here. Not the surface of it. The thing underneath. A man who built an empire on control discovered, at 56, that the most structurally sound thing he had ever constructed was not made of power or money or the carefully maintained fear of his name in certain rooms. It was made of consistency. Of showing up in a doorway at 3 in the morning without a script. Of learning the difference between two kinds of silence. Of driving someone to school every morning because the driving was a language and the language said, "You are not temporary." He built it without knowing he was building it. The way the most important things get built. And a girl who had every reason to close herself off completely, who had been handed, before she was old enough to understand what was happening, an extraordinary quantity of evidence that love was unreliable and people left and the safest position was the one that required the least from anyone else. Chose, instead, to leave the door open. Not because she was naive. Not because she hadn't been hurt enough to know better. But because some part of her, some stubborn, undefeated, irreducible part of her that not one single difficult year had managed to extinguish, had decided that closing the door completely was a kind of dying she wasn't willing to do. She held the space. For years. Without any guarantee. Without any evidence. For a long time. That it was safe to. Just held it. And eventually, someone walked through. That is the transformation. The transformation is what happened inside the people while the events were occurring. The transformation is a man learning that the thing he spent 30 years believing was weakness, softness, love, the willingness to be changed by another person, was, in fact, the only thing that saved him. The transformation is a woman discovering that the quality she had spent years trying to manage in herself, that wide-open, undefended, total way of seeing people, was not a liability. It was the most powerful thing in the room. Nia went back to London 3 weeks later. She didn't stay. That matters too. Because the story that ends with her returning permanently, folding her life back into his world, becoming part of the organizational structure, subordinating the self she built to the relationship that built her, is not this story. She had a life. She went back to it. She called on Sundays. She came home for holidays and for the occasional long weekend, and for the moments when something in her father's voice told her, without either of them naming it, that he needed her nearby. She did not dissolve into the relationship. She remained, fully, insistently, without apology, herself. What had changed for her was quieter than what had changed for Jinho, and she preferred it that way. She had walked back into the most dangerous room of his world and discovered that she hadn't needed to become someone else to survive it. She had used exactly what she was. And for a woman who had spent years being told, in various ways, that what she was wasn't quite enough, that was not a small thing. Because that is what healthy love produces. Not merger. Not the erasure of oneself into the needs of another. It produces two people who are more fully themselves because of each other, who carry the relationship as a foundation rather than a ceiling, who love each other in the way that makes the world larger, not smaller. Jinho restructured things in the months that followed. He reduced his direct involvement in the organizational machinery, not abruptly, not in the reactive way of a man running from something, but with the deliberate patience of someone who has finally identified what he actually wants the remaining years of his life to look like. This story was never only about them. You were never the reason people left. You were a person with real needs in environments that didn't have the capacity to meet them. That is a statement about the environments, not about you. The leaving was never the verdict on your worth. It was the limitation of the people who couldn't stay. And the two things are not the same. They have never been the same, even when every single cell in your body has spent years insisting that they are. Nia kept the paper bag. It was not in good condition. The paper had softened with age and the pen marks had faded to the point where you had to know what you were looking at to see it clearly. But she had kept it. That girl is still in you, regardless of everything that has happened since. Regardless of how many times the door was closed from the other side. Regardless of how many times you decided, in the private and exhausted aftermath of another disappointment, that hope was a luxury you could no longer afford. She is still there. The one who drew the door open. The one who held the space. The one who looked at a hollow-eyed stranger in an alley and thought, worth being afraid for. Jinho understood something on that rooftop that he had spent 56 years approaching from every direction without ever arriving at directly. That the most dangerous thing he had ever done was not anything that belonged to the world he had built. It was sitting down in an alley in Los Angeles. In his worst moment. With nothing to offer and nothing to gain, and no strategic calculation behind it. Just sitting down. Next to a child who wasn't afraid of him. And staying. The moment you stop asking the world to prove you were worth staying for, is the moment you remember that you already know the answer. You drew it on a paper bag at 7 years old. You left the door open. Even then,